Welcome to the Michael Shermer Show. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. My guest today, very special guest, Jennifer Sciubba. Her new book is 8 Billion and Counting: How Sex, Death, and Migration Shape Our World. As it happens, Jennifer is an associate professor of international studies at Rhodes College, and she's a former demographics consultant to the United States Department of Defense. And therefore, I'm very interested to speak to her today because we discuss Russia and Ukraine. What are the prospects for global security? Putin's MO, is he a savvy chess player or a deranged madman? I ask her, will outcasting of Russia work to reverse Putin's revanchism? That is to say, outcasting is you just refuse to do business with a country ever again, starting with economic sanctions. And we've seen those unfolding. They haven't stopped him yet, but we'll see what the outcome of that is. We talk about, could the conflict escalate from armed conflict between Russia and Ukraine to NATO and the U.S. and the result in the use of tactical nuclear weapons and in the end, global thermonuclear war? I know that sounds crazy, but you'll get her thoughts on that. Why can't Russians just rise up and overthrow Putin? Well, you'll hear why that is. What is political demography, which is Jennifer's profession, and how are those tools applied to the future of global security in the teeth of Russian aggression? We talk about migrations and the humanitarian crisis now in Ukraine, and then before that in Syria and Somalia and so forth. And then we pull back and talk about the general larger picture. Is demography destiny? What does it mean for a country to be old or young? How do they calculate these birth rates and death rates, and how accurate are those? Is that data? The population of a country, the age of the different age cohorts, and so forth. I bring up Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb, which I remember when that came out. I think I was in middle school at the time, and here's his quote: "The battle to feed all of humanity is over. In the 1970s, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death in spite of any crash programs embarked upon now. At this late date, nothing can prevent a substantial increase in the world death rate." Well, that never happened. Why is that? And then we talk about some other big picture issues. How many people have ever lived on Earth? How many people can the Earth sustain? That is, what's the carrying capacity of Earth? And at 8 billion and counting, when are we going to hit 9 billion, 10, 11? Will it peak and then drop by 2021? Where will we be? How do we know how many people live in these different countries? What does it mean to say a country is old or young? Again, we'll come back to that. And as medical science and technology advance, how old could people live, and how will countries support retirees who live for decades beyond retirement? And then we talk about family planning and birth control, abortion and unwanted pregnancies, China's one-child policy and its consequences, and other related issues. So, enjoy this conversation with Jennifer Sciubba. I certainly did. Nice to see you, Jennifer Sciubba. Congratulations on the new book, 8 Billion and Counting. Who knew that we could get that high? Sex, Death, and Migration, and How They Shape the World. So, we're speaking to you on March 2nd. The UN General Assembly just condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine. You work in national security issues. You work for the Department of Defense. Let's just jump right in and address the Russian elephant in the room. What is going on over there? Did you predict this? Were you totally surprised? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I didn't see it as a surprise, and I think the danger with having a book, the lag time between finishing a book and having it come out, is something might happen in the world that would totally undermine your argument. That didn't happen in this case, although I wish it had, because then maybe we'd have a more peaceful world. But anyone who reads the book will see whenever I'm talking about Russia, I'm really going against this thesis that has wormed its way into the media and into some scholarship, that a graying world of aging states, will be a more peaceful one. And this has been talked about specifically with regard to Russia. And I saw it during my time at the Pentagon, which is the mid-aughts. And then as I've continued to engage with those communities in different consulting roles over the years, it's been a sticky thesis. And I have an idea why I think that it has been sticky. But I really engage with that in the book and show hey, you don't just look at demographic trends. Be careful. And there's not a person who could walk away from the book saying, demography is destiny. We can print it on a t-shirt and that's the end of it. There's so much more in how we need to interpret that. And in Russia's case, we have not at any point seen a gray piece or a geriatric piece. Instead, Russia has just continued to flout our expectations with engaging in this kind of behavior over time. So I think population is still really relevant to the story of Russia. Doesn't explain everything, but really relevant. But it does fit with what we've been seeing over the last several decades.
By a grain or older population, you mean by some operational definition, the percentage of the population over 65 versus under 15 or something like that?
Yeah, that's one way to define it. I like a shorter and even easier way to do it, the shorthand of median age. Just we lined up everybody in the country theoretically, and we pointed to the middle person and raise your hand. How old are you? Kind of shows to me where the center of gravity is in a population, and it's a nice way to compare across countries. And yeah, so they're getting older. They're mid, upper 30s, around 38 years old. But you know who else is mid upper 30s? Is the United States and China as well. We're all right around 37 or 38 for our median age. But Russia's population also at times has been shrinking years on end. And so I think that's really what garnered people's attention, talking about this incredibly powerful bloc that existed and then singular country. And can a country with a shrinking population retain global influence? That's the question people have been asking.
Right. So the thesis would be here then that older people are less likely to be combative or revanchist and just want to settle down and have a successful economy or something like that. But maybe the Russians is not the right word. Maybe it's Putin. It's just Putin. What if it's just one man driving all of this and no one can stand up to him? And it doesn't really matter what the demographics of Russia or Ukraine or the United States are. It's just one madman.
Absolutely. And I think that's really what I try to say over and over is be careful if you're going to project the future just based on your assumptions about these demographic trends, because you can be really wrong and that would be really dangerous. This is a great example of that. Russian demographics may point in one direction, but if the decision making power is concentrated in one person's hands, then that matters. And that actually happens with democracies as well. I'm a political scientist by training, and I use demographics to better understand the world. But that means I go back to institutions a lot, political institutions. Who has the power and influence in a society by the rules? And I think all of my research points to the power of institutions as this mediating factor for population, like how it spits out at the
Hmm. Right. So when you worked at the Department of Defense, well, since you worked at the Department of Defense and you work in national security issues, how should we be thinking about Putin now? As a savvy chess player that we should play a kind of game theoretic back and forth with? Is he just a madman and we should just send Rambo and the Navy SEALs to take him out? Or, how do you think about dealing with a guy like this?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I don't think anybody exactly knows. That's why any of us can log on to Twitter and follow people who they make this their business. And it's like for every person, there's a different opinion. I think we always have to assume a rational actor. That's how political science training coming into play there. Uh, but I don't know. I'm glad I don't have to be the decision maker. I'll say that.
Mm, right. Me too. I wouldn't know what to do other than it seems to me outcasting. I sent you that article I wrote on the
Yeah.
outcasting versus actually armed conflict. It does seem to work on average, not 100%. Nothing's 100% in political science, but economic sanctions and just basically kicking them out of all international organizations and so on, and then taking them off the SWIFT program and all that to hurt them economically. Of course, the tragedy is that it's probably going to hurt the Russian people, not him personally, because he's worth tens of billions apparently and is holed up in some mansion somewhere, and it's probably he won't feel any of it. But his people may. feel it, and why can't they just rise up and overthrow him?
Uh, I know that's what role do you think information plays in this? I think that's the interesting thing too. Like we have to layer this economic argument, which I think is a persuasive one. I mean, money. That's part of the reason that people think that demographically older countries would be more peaceful is because they think they'll be broke. So, money is definitely part of this. I wonder too about information uh, and how it's really reaching people and how empowered they feel to act on that by taking to the streets. I mean, that's really how is it that people in that regime can express their discontent? How can they have influence to say, stop doing this?
Right. Well, they are. Of course, if you were in Russia watching American media during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars and you saw thousands of people protesting, you might think, well, they're going to overthrow the Bush administration. And, well, that was never even remotely close to happening. It's just people protest the way it goes. Not everybody's going to agree with your national policies. But it certainly does seem like Putin's going against the grain of history there. I hope the sanctions work. I really don't know. And now, he rattled his nuclear saber a little bit, maybe. And our own Department of Defense said, "Oh, we're not going to, respond to that by scaling up and escalating the game by raising our alert status." Although I can't help but think that they must have at least alerted all the nuclear triad directors or leaders or whoever runs those things to put them on something like, we should pay extra close attention here just in case. Is there any chance that could say armed conflict and then it spills over? There's some accident. Maybe the Russians shoot down a NATO plane or the NATO shoots down a Russian plane, and then there's armed conflict, and then maybe Putin uses a battlefield tactical nuclear weapon, which is very small, but that's a nuclear weapon, and then you counter with something larger, and then before you know it, you have global thermonuclear war.
Yeah, I'm I'm an optimist. I'm a big believer that the nuclear taboo works. I don't think it's the treaties that have made us not use nuclear weapons. I don't I don't think it's anything like that. I think it's the norms, which is funny because I just finished saying I'm an institutionalist, so it kind of goes against it. But in this case, I think there is power behind that idea. Nobody's done it since the last time they did it. Nobody's done it, and the first person who does changes the entire game, and it's just the most amazing responsibility to change that game. And I think that's why I think it is important for us to think of Putin as a rational actor who will realize that that would be an absolute turning point in world affairs that we've not seen before, because we didn't understand when we use them the first time. We're in a different world today where I think that norm is strong enough to keep it from happening. I like to believe that.
I think you're probably right. The norms are powerful. I mean, biological, chemical weapons, and namely poison gas, was banned after the First World War, and it's not like the Nazis had any compunction against using gas on Jews, but they didn't use it on the battlefield. So that is a peculiar thing. So it could just be that's just not what soldiers do. We just don't do that. We don't use gas. That's just not just strategically, but that's just not the right thing to do. And maybe nuclear weapons shares that taboo now.
Yeah, I think it's probably even stronger because you do see these isolated uses in different contexts. About the sarin gas, I think that taboo is not as strong and complete as the nuclear taboo, and I'm going to hold hope out because right now that one is completely intact in my mind.
Yeah, yeah. When you read the accounts of like 1960s conversations with people in the Defense Department and the
Yeah,
what's the think tank in Santa Monica, I forget the name of it now, but
Rand.
they did these, the Rand Corporation, yeah, they did these calculations of how many
Yeah,
people would die, and they're throwing these numbers out like, oh, just 10 million, 20 million. I mean, it was very much like Dr. Strangelove, and Kubrick was a student of nuclear war game theory strategies, and there's that scene where General Buck Turgidson is telling the president, since we've had this madman go off and and send our bomber there, we might as well launch a full on initial strike and just take them all out. And I'm not saying we wouldn't get our hair mussed, but 10, 20 million tops, depending on the breaks of just Americans, 10 to 20 million dead. I mean, it's just staggering. And those are real numbers that people talked about then.
Oh, yeah. I like to think that, I mean, if the taboo were broken, the response would be total. That would finally unite everyone. I think we still see some hesitancy with India, and now trying to with Russia. I think that might bring people together. And then you could have all kinds of generations of scholars talking about world unity in light of nuclear explosion. But I hope that.
Mm. Right. Okay. Let's seg into talking more about your book. How does one become a political demographer? Give us a little bit of your own demographic history. Where were you born and raised, and where did you go to school, and how did you get interested in this particular subject?
Sure, I'm happy to talk about it because it actually goes right to this book. It's a neat and tidy little story. I am Southern, as I'm sure everyone can hear, and have spent most of my life in the South. I grew up in Georgia, and I currently live in Tennessee. And I have always been really interested in the environment and thinking about environmental issues. But early on in my college career, and so I went to Agnes Scott College in Atlanta. It's a small women's college in the city. And in those classes, I got really interested in, and I was interested in national security, and I used to love to read Tom Clancy. So we've got to think what on earth brings together somebody who would take these, old tuna fish cans and like poke holes in them and try to make bubble bath with soap, really in this reusing and super greeny person, but who also loves reading about the Cold War and spy novels and all of these things. And so when I was in college majoring in international relations, and I studied Japanese, but it's been a long time, so I don't speak it anymore. Trying to understand why countries go to war and how you get peace, the environment kept coming up for me. And this was late 1990s. And I remember asking my advisor, are there people who study how the environment affects war and peace? And she said, yes, absolutely. You should go to University of Maryland for graduate school because there's a lot of really great people there doing environmental work. And then you'd be in Washington, D.C. And I really didn't know much about, I didn't have a lot of people in my family who had gone to college or anything like that. So I think I got very lucky, and I did enroll in University of Maryland PhD program in government and politics. And while I had been an undergrad, I was really interested in Japan and marriage issues there, gender issues there, studied migration some for Asia because that's what my advisor studied. Then I kind of took that into graduate school and into some environmental politics courses. And my graduate school advisor noticed I was interested in population aging. And he said, you should really think about specializing in this if you're that interested in it, because nobody's doing it and you can make a name for yourself really quickly. And that turned out to be true. There are still very few of us, particularly who look at population aging and national security. And the book came about for a couple of reasons. One is that while I was working on my dissertation, I wasn't sure if I wanted to be an academic. And so I wanted to dip my toe into other waters. And once I finished my coursework, I got an internship. I was an old intern, oldest intern. It turns out there are benefits to being the old intern at Defense Intelligence Agency. So I brought the spy novel part full circle and said, what would it be like to work in intelligence? And I did enjoy it, but it wasn't as creative as I liked. I needed a creative outlet. I got very lucky, right place, right time, but luck favors the prepared also. Someone I knew from graduate school happened to be working in the Office of Strategy for the Undersecretary for Policy. And he knew that I had expertise in demographics and asked if I would come up and just talk to his bosses really quickly. And the person I sat and talked to is Kathleen Hicks, who's now at the Pentagon in a very high position. And they brought me on board immediately, which was amazing for me. And so I spent a couple of years working in Office of Strategy, which then changed names to Policy Planning. It goes back and forth. And I learned so much in that time there about what questions people have about demographic trends. I mean, that was really my big takeaway. I would try to answer questions as they came up. A lot of talk about China, of course, as the air quotes near peer competitor. Understanding, is NATO still useful? That was one of the questions that came up. What does an aging NATO mean? America's other allies are aging. What does that do for us? Where should we position our troops around the world in order to make sure it makes demographic sense for where people are growing or shrinking? Where is there going to be conflict? All of those things. And I felt like it was time to leave when I had a big old list of questions and I had run out of answers. And I knew that would shape my research agenda. And that's exactly what it's done. And I return to those communities often to see what questions they're asking now. And so the book, it answers those questions. It basically compiles there's a huge list of frequently asked questions. People want to understand some of those dynamics that I just talked about. And I walk through the answers that I see, but also I leave some room there, really trying to show people how to do this themselves. So I feel like this is a book on how to read the world, because trends can change really quickly, but thinking does not. And I especially notice this with national security. Ideas that were sticky, 10 or 15 years ago, they hang around even when the trend has been completely different. So if I just tried to, give a snapshot of demographic trends in this book, it would be old before it hit the shelves. And so instead, what I'm trying to do is walk people through, how do you do this? And
Yes,
that's the
indeed.
big
So
theory of where the book came out.
yeah, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to tell one other funny story. So it's called 8 Billion and Counting. And so I will never forget, when I was an undergraduate, my Chinese history professor was late to class one day, and then she showed up at the door, and she was eccentric to begin with. But that day she paused at the door. She had this black armband on, and she marched into the room and she said, "Today is a world travesty. We have hit 6 billion people. I cannot believe this. You should never have children, because this is the end of the world as we know it. We're headed for disaster. I never had children. I did my part. You should never do this." And that was 1999. And so we hit these milestones of billions really infrequently. But there's no doubt in my mind that just, I can see her still in my head today.
Wow.
And so when I think about the world hitting 8 billion people, I definitely have her to thank for piquing my interest in the idea of, what does this total number really mean?
But you have children, right?
I do. I do have children. I didn't buy into it the way she said.
Why
I
not?
thought, in general, I'm always saying, you're oversimplifying. You're oversimplifying. And I was even a professor by the time we hit 7 billion, which was in 2011. And I'm a professor and I teach environmental courses. And people still talk a lot about overpopulation at the undergraduate level. And so they come to me with the assumption that the world is overpopulated, and it's a really simple story. And I hope I always add some nuance in there for them. Be careful about that. That's a lot going on when you say the world is overpopulated.
Right. I wanted to bring up Paul Ehrlich's population bomb. That was big when I was in high school, and all those predictions he made. I'll just read to you his most famous line that everybody quotes: "The battle to feed all of humanity is over. In the 1970s, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death in spite of any crash programs embarked upon now. At this late date, nothing can prevent a substantial increase in the world death rate." And that never happened. And here's a few other quotes. This is Garrett Hardin, the famous ecologist who coined the tragedy of the commons problem, in a highly influential article in Science, no less. Quote, "The freedom to breed is intolerable." Breed. They treat humans like we're cattle. World Watch Institute founder Lester Brown answered in the affirmative his own question: asked in a 2012 Scientific American article, could food shortages bring down civilization? He continues, it is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. I mean, this is just astonishing that people, and these are liberals, presumably. I find them
I know.
rather illiberal
Yeah.
in their attitudes toward humans, as if, again, we're just cattle and just snip them all so they can't breed anymore. Them, not us, of course, the elite.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Oh, right.
I find that so frustrating. But that never happened, right? Why did that not happen?
Yeah. And you say us, and it's like, especially us, this kind of us. So there, women get thrown under the bus a lot with this. It's
Mm-hmm.
women who ultimately have the babies, and there's huge gender implications. That's one of the lessons I try to show my students when they say overpopulation. I say, just be careful. Who do you really blame for this? You start peeling back the layers of the onions, you get to a lot of weird gender stuff there. So, um,
Mm-hmm.
women either have too many or too few. It's like Goldilocks. We never have just the right number. You can find this all across the world. Um,
Mm.
so why didn't it happen? I'm going to give Paul Ehrlich a little bit of grace in one area, but I'll say it didn't happen at a really simple level because for the same reason that original Malthusianism, Malthus was off, and that's it. We just forget technology is
Mm.
part of it. So, widespread use and availability of contraception makes a big difference. He was also off because I think he couldn't have foreseen or didn't foresee um, how fertility trends fall with education and rising standards of living naturally. So people's preferences also change. And, when you're writing in 1968, you could have already seen that in the US if you had been looking. But given how in your face the baby boom would have been, baby boomers, I should say, would have been politically, it might not have been quite as obvious that the low fertility trend was on the horizon or was really already happening. But that's another thing that wasn't necessarily foreseen, which is how quickly fertility would start falling all over the world as people became more educated, as women became more educated and began to prefer fewer children, and then they could act on it with technology, and then also our technology with food production. I mean, that has made a huge difference. Green revolution is not so green in the sense of environment, but green in the sense of being able to get larger yield per lot of land made a big difference for population. But where I give him a little bit of grace, and this is not popular with everybody, is that I think he scared a generation of policymakers into action. So part of the quote that you read said, even if, and this is just me paraphrasing, but it's like, even if we do something now, this is going to happen. A lot of policymakers really sprung into action, a lot of foundations sprung into action with trying to push educational programs and family planning and reproductive health programs around the world. There was a dark side to it because some of it ended up being forced sterilization. Never condone that. But you do see the seeds of our modern campaigns about reproductive health and family planning in that, and that does make a difference for those long-term trends as well.
Right. So the idea is to tilt the incentives so that people choose to have fewer babies, and the forces nudging them in that direction are education, um, information about birth control, and then access to birth control, either cheap or free through healthcare plans. And what other factors? Economic empowerment of women. I understand from your book is part of it. What else?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, if it's if there are economic opportunities outside the home, and women are brought into the workforce that way, then there's simply less time to have children. And um, I think you really covered the main ones, and most people, I believe, would argue that those are just inherent societal goods. to say, hey, we're going to work on having a really healthy, well-educated population. But the byproduct of that is people choose to have fewer children.
Right. So it's almost like a natural force. Social scientists are looking for, teasing apart the causal variables at work. There is no single variable. So demography is not destiny. Neither is geography. I have another book coming up on the podcast. Geography is Destiny is the title. Ian Morris.
Oh,
Anyway, yeah.
oh yeah.
So, there's no one variable, but of course, maybe there's half a dozen, and you run your regression equations and try to figure out, this one accounts for 40% of the variance and that one for 20% of the variance or whatever. So that's what you're doing. And this is why, say, the Department of Defense and national security issues would be interested in your work, right? Because if say 20% of the variance between countries on whatever it is you're interested in is affected by their demography, and we know that we're at 38 and they're at 22 or whatever of their average age, then
Right.
they're going to nudge and they're going to move in one direction. So we should put some troops over there. We should provide aid for them or their neighbors or something like that. Is that how you think about those issues?
Yeah, I think it's risk assessment. A lot of people who
Mm,
do forecasting and risk assessment, that's what the national security community and the business community have in common. The place where do you want to park your money and where do you want to invest in the world is really similar to the kind of calculus that the Department of Defense would do with where are we going to be seeing peace and stability. Those two things align well there. And so political demography is really useful for risk analysis and mapping that out in the world. And I know I believe in the power of demography. It has huge implications, um, but it's not the only factor. But it does give us a really good starting point to go around the world and say, countries that have 50% of the population is under the age of 18. It's be very difficult to establish a functioning democracy there or to just think about governance in general. And it gives you a whole menu of the type of needs that the country will have. I mean, those people are not in the labor market for the most part. A lot of them are incredibly young. Um, so it's a good place to get the lay of the land, the really base kind of view of the world of what's going on and strengths and weaknesses.
yeah, let me read a portion of your opening chapter, your introduction here, and then ask you some questions about how you know this. On average, there are about 240 babies born every minute in the world's least developed countries, but only 25 born per minute in developed countries. If we were to go to the heart of the Japanese countryside, we would likely see a lot of gray hair. 50% of Japan's population is over the age of 48, the world's oldest. Japan is aging so rapidly that if current trends continue, the nation could eventually disappear altogether. What? Okay, I'm going to come back to that. Officially, the Japanese government projects that Japan's population will shrink from 128 million in 2010 to 87 million by 2060. At that time, an astonishing 40% of Japanese will be 65 years or older. That is unprecedented in human history. And then you flip to the other side of the world. If we were to go to crowded urban areas of Lagos, Nigeria, though, we would likely be inundated with the sounds of children playing. Medium age 18. Nigeria is on the other end of the spectrum. Fully half of Nigeria's population is children and adolescents. These huge cohorts will soon be mothers and fathers themselves. The eldest of them already are. So, first of all, just as a research question, how do you know those numbers are accurate? I mean, who's counting and who's reporting that? And are there error bars, plus or minus 1%, or how's that work?
Oh, for sure. Yes, I think in general we're only as good as our data. It's really hard to know for sure. These data come from the UN, which collects data from individual statistical agencies. They kind of weigh factors and projections. There are other organizations that do projections as well and do current counts. A lot of what we know come from smaller surveys, sample surveys that are then, um, extrapolated to look at a whole region. The nice thing is, and this gets to that point again that it doesn't you this could have some shelf life here because you don't have to know what if it's 46. Guess what? The implications are the same. Or if it's 20 versus 18, the implications would be the same. Both of those places have decent record keeping for us to know that, but so we can feel really good and confident that we can start drawing some conclusions about those numbers. They're good enough. Migration's the tricky.
Right, because not all countries want social scientists snooping around in their records, right? Autocrats and theocracies and so on, maybe. North Korea,
Well, and
Iraq,
even
maybe
if
Iran.
somebody is mired in conflict, it's incredibly hard to keep track of these kinds of things. So yeah, that's tough. And so sometimes I've talked to some demographers who explained to me about some of the data gathering. Some will literally go into communities and say, "How many children do you have? How many children did your parents have?" And then they might ask a sibling the same thing, and they get different answers from different people. And so it's their job. I'm grateful to not be the demographer who's just who's collecting the data. But I think they've developed a lot of great methods over time to find greater confidence in their numbers. And they see enough patterns with you survey people about something, to what degree do they tell you what you want to hear versus the actual truth, and so they can account for those margins.
Yeah, self-report data is always a problem in the
Yeah.
social sciences, but what else do we have? In some cases, that's
Mhm.
it. One reason, I mean, I trust your data. I think that it's, plus or minus 1%, whatever. It's probably good enough to make some predictions. But I'll note a story from a friend of mine, one of my cycling buddies that lives in Central California. And in 2019, when the U.S. Census was being conducted, he volunteered to go door to door. And Central California is like the largest breadbasket in the country for agriculture. So we have a lot of undocumented workers there. And, he told me going door to door, he had a lot of doors slammed in his face. Like, we don't want to talk to you. We're not interested in the government coming in here and keeping track of how many of us are here and who's documented, who's not, and all that. I thought, that's curious. I wonder if that skews some of this data.
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you on this, and actually, I don't. From everything that I've seen, kind of following the demographic circles, nobody's planning to use any of the data from the census because they seem to be that messed up. And then, yeah, now imagine that in a country that's maybe got even less of an infrastructure for things. So, most of these researchers are not just relying on one source, which that gives us a lot more confidence. And they're running programs, demographic and health surveys and other surveys that have been done longitudinally. And there's researchers that are on the ground that have been working on this that have input as well. So as far as current numbers go, we always have to leave some margin of error. But the good news is, for what I do, it doesn't affect the analysis.
Mm. What do you
We're
mean when
not
you
going to
say
all of a
Japan?
sudden find out, oh, we were wrong. Japan's really young.
Oh, yeah, it's not going to be off that much, right? But when you
Yeah.
say Japan is aging so rapidly that if current trends continue, the nation could eventually disappear altogether. What in the world do you mean by that? What do you mean it could disappear?
Yeah, I'm not a big clickbait person. I really try to be, true to my social science roots. And that sounds really clickbaity, but it's quite simple. That's how things go over time, that every generation is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And if the average woman is having fewer than replacement level children, which would be at least two, one to replace the mommy, one to replace the daddy, if the average woman is having fewer than that, then as we move through time, the cohort of women who are having children is smaller than the preceding one, is smaller than the preceding one, and so on and so forth. And so that's how pretty simple to project that it gets smaller because we haven't seen a turnaround. So what changes that? What makes it not
Mm.
just
Well,
clickbait?
so
We don't see a
presumably
turnaround.
the Japanese government knows what you know and what you just wrote.
Yeah,
And so somebody must be reading that going, you know what, maybe we should do something. Maybe we should incentivize through tax breaks for families to have more children or something like that. Or, not
yeah.
be so generous with birth control education and as part of our healthcare program or something like that. I don't know. I'm reminded of Stein's Law. Do you know Stein's Law, Herb Stein? Things that can't go on forever won't.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and that's so. Do we go all the way in the future and say, does Japan abandon democracy in order to increase the Japanese population? I, I don't know, but what a great exercise for us to think, what does it take for a country to move that to say this is the number one problem facing the country? You know, Putin has said population is the number one problem facing Russia. And then we look at what are the set of options that people see when they place this as their number one problem. The difference between Japan and Russia, of course, is there are several, but let's just say form of government and leadership. And it would take something like Romania's Ceausescu to say women must submit. I mean, I do not want this. Let's make that really clear. Women must submit to monthly gynecological examinations up to age of 45. We've banned all birth control. So we've seen this plenty of times in the past when leaders get obsessed with their population numbers. I like to be hopeful that that doesn't happen in a democracy.
Right. So that's a good contrast. China's one child rule versus Ceausescu's you have to have as many babies as you can. Well, in the latter experiment, it was disastrous because you ended up with these orphanages with all these kids that nobody wanted. So that doesn't seem to work. How do you assess at this
Nope.
point China's one child rule or law?
Yeah, it's they're both examples. They'd seem really different, but they're both examples of how those policies were not stronger than the social norms. And what I mean by that is, as soon as the rules ended in Romania, you revert to the mean. You know, people went back to having fewer children. That it was artificially pumped up because of that. And then China is another example where the policy, once it's removed, we see how powerful the social norms were. So fertility was already falling in China prior to the one child policy. One child policy comes in. Most demographers agree that it did accelerate the decline. But what happens is, but we also see similar declines in countries in the same region that didn't have the one child policy. Plus, when China removes the one child policy, we don't get a big spike in births. So that if we were without the policy, we still revert to the power of those social norms. People just didn't want to have that many children. So as far as total population numbers go, it's absolutely true that if you use coercive policies, pro-natalist or anti-natalist, you can make a difference. But social norms are the more powerful than the policy.
Yes, and of course, at this point, you have to enter civil rights and rights issues and
Oh my
women's
gosh.
rights and
Yeah.
reproductive rights and all that, which should trump the policy. But your point is, it doesn't work regardless of whose rights are being violated.
Yeah, it's only in there as long as you're willing to basically point a gun at somebody's head and force them in that direction, using your all of your sticks to do that. We see a lot of the times the carrots and sticks, softer sticks, I suppose we could say, less coercive policies, they don't even work to change people's behavior because a lot of low fertility countries have tried to raise fertility exactly as you mentioned through tax incentives and things like that. And that's not enough to get a country that has average number of children per woman of say 1.3 up to 2.3. It just doesn't work.
Well, our government does this. I'm a parent. I get a tax break for having a child, underage child. So apparently, the U.S. government wants
Is
me
that
to
why you
have
had
more
one
children.
though?
Now, I
Yeah.
didn't have a child
Does it
because I
did
get
it
a
work?
tax break. No, well, I mean, it's when I look at the numbers, it's like, well, I wouldn't have children just because I
I know,
get $500 off or whatever.
right?
It's
Right.
not a big incentive,
Yep.
but it's the idea of nudging people. For example, I own a
Yeah.
home, so I can deduct the interest on my mortgage. Well, so apparently the government is nudging me to be a homeowner. And so all governments do this. I guess the question is, yeah, it's more of like what Cass Sunstein calls libertarian paternalism, which sounds like an oxymoron, but you're giving people a choice. You don't have to buy a house. You don't have to have a kid. But if you do, we're going to give you a little bonus for doing that because we want you to do that. So I guess the question would then be, if you were in charge of a government, what's the right number? 2.1 children per family, or if we want to have a stable population in the long run.
Yeah. You know, the right number is actually whatever people want, because that to really get to the idea of values, the right number is whatever people want, because it's an issue of level of analysis. So if we're looking at individuals and you have to sit there and I would look at you and you would look at me and you would tell me the right number of children to have, to think about, your whole family life and what you like to do for fun and maybe what your bank account looks like and all kinds of really intimate details. And the same for me. And so when we bring it down to the individual level of analysis, it's really uncomfortable to think, well, I'd like to go through my neighborhood here and make sure each of these women have 2 kids. Or if this one wants to have 3, then her neighbor can have just 1. And if this one wants to have 4, then it's okay that this other person has 0. So individual level analysis is where we really see how the rubber meets the road. It's really tricky. If we're talking in the aggregate, sure, replacement level sounds lovely. That's back to Goldilocks. Too many, too few, just right. And so you get this stovepipe shaped population, if we were to look at it as a snapshot, where there's just as many people coming into the workforce as exiting the workforce each year, and we fill those kindergarten desks and we fill the nursing homes, and everything is just stable year on end. But people don't seem to hang out at that 2.1. It's really uncommon for a country to stay there. It's like a stopping point on your way to low fertility. Um, but hitting the replacement level, staying there, don't have a lot of examples of that. It's obviously really hard, and I think it's because look at that individual level.
Right. So when you say Putin says we have a population problem, he means underpopulation. In the long run, we need to have more
That's right.
people. Yeah. Right. So
Or
why did that
Russia.
happen? I mean, we don't think of Russia as like a super advanced, well, I guess they are technological, but educational, women's rights. You don't think of it like that. Maybe I'm wrong. But why did their population decline? Why is it declining?
Yeah, it was enough. I mean, it's enough to of women are educated and choose to have fewer children. There are also a good portion of scholarship looking at, yeah, Eastern Europe in general. I'm going to put Russia in with Eastern Europe for these purposes. That talks about hope for the future as one of those many influences on fertility, and uh, looking at a lot of post-communist states and economic stress and also social stress, and whether or not people feel hopeful about the future and how that affects how many children they have. So we also see that there's some evidence for that thesis at work. So yeah, Russia has had below replacement fertility for a while, and they also
Right.
had high mortality. That's the other piece.
Right. Yeah. From what? Too much vodka? World War II?
Yeah, isn't that sound so oversimplified to say? Uh, and I really kept looking into this more in the book, because we know I think I call it one of those tropes that's actually true. Uh, that alcohol abuse in Russia really played a huge role in that low mortality for men that we saw a couple of decades ago. And some of the laws, and so you actually can see a lot of research in the public health journals about how Russia's campaigns to reduce use of alcohol were really effective, and then that can be used as a model in other countries and other issue areas as well. So they've turned some of that around, and mortality for men is not as low as it used to be. But it was like among the lowest in the world.
What is the what's the causal chain there of drinking too much and having fewer babies? Are these guys just passing out before they have sex with their wives and therefore they're having
Uh,
fewer babies? What's the
separate,
How does this
separate. They
happen?
don't want to do it. So you've got, population grows from 3 ingredients. That's then the title of the book, Sex, Death, and Migration, right? So population grows from fertility, mortality, and migration. So when you're looking at a country that the population is shrinking, you say, what's going down? I like to think of them as 3 dials. They're kind of turned to different intensities, and then you see this outcome on the end. So if you're already at below replacement fertility, about 1 point, somewhere between 1.4 and 1.6 for some of this period of time we're talking about, that's going to get you eventually to population shrinking if there's no migration. Mortality was high, so that dial's kind of turned to high there. People are not living into their ripe old ages, and some of them really dying in the prime of life, so that makes your population shrink even in the short term. But then Russia has been a major destination for migrants around the world. Um, so that helps contribute some to population growth. So you kind of have to take all of those factors.
Yeah, I forgot about the universal education that all Russians get. Yes, okay, so that would include women. So they're gonna that variable will work. But China is a communist state. Why did this not happen in China?
Which part not happen?
The population turning around and starting to decline.
Well, we're not there yet, so they're just behind. So we are already looking at labor forces peaking, and the story. If we were to, you and I were to jump back on here in 20 years, we would be talking about you know China's population shrinking. So we're
Mm.
getting there, and it's not because
So
they're a
they're.
communist country. It's just because those low
I see.
fertility norms.
I see. I see.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, interesting.
Isn't it
All
crazy
right.
though to think about China as a shrinking country after all of these decades of thinking about China having so many people?
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's always been the conversation. It's startling to even think that that could happen. All right, let's talk about some of the bigger issues here. And let me introduce this idea of how many people have ever lived. I'm going to read to you page one from 2001, A Space Odyssey. This is Arthur C. Clarke's, little one-page nonfiction intro to this book. You're probably familiar with this, but here's what he writes.
Yeah.
I read this in high school and thought, how does he know that? Behind every man now alive stand 30 ghosts, for that is the ratio by which the dead outnumber the living. Since the dawn of time, roughly 100 billion human beings have walked the planet Earth. Now, this is an interesting number, for by a curious coincidence, there are approximately 100 billion stars in our local universe, the Milky Way. So for every man who's ever lived in this universe, there shines a star. But every one of those stars is a sun, often far more brilliant and glorious than the small nearby star we call the sun. And many, perhaps most of these alien suns have planets circling them. So almost certainly there's enough land in the sky to give every member of the human species back to the first ape man his own private world-sized heaven or hell. How many of these potential heavens and hells are now inhabited, and by what manner of creatures, we have no way of guessing. And then he goes on, and of course, that's the idea of the novel. But I remember thinking, how do you know 100 billion people lived before us? And you cite that number too. How do we know?
Yeah, I mean, I like to believe the demographers on this one. And again, I didn't have to do those calculations myself, but they've got their ways of doing the math. And I think for
Oh,
me, the takeaway, and the interesting part, yeah, could you still hear me?
yeah. Yeah, I hear you. Yeah.
Yeah, I, yeah, I think for me, the takeaway is, as I try to point out, who makes it. So we have these people who were born, and you look back over time, all of human history, it took until all of human history until the year 1800 for us to have our first 1 billion people alive at the same time on the planet. So, uh, to me, the thing to latch onto about these big, grand numbers is, um, who makes it? You might take your first breath, but how long is it between your first breath and your last breath? And so what we've seen over time is that of those people who've ever been born, which the numbers I see now are somewhere around 47 billion, and we're not sure, but what proportion of those people are alive at once? And so we are at a time where a greater like a greater proportion of people, of all the people who have been born, are alive now. It's always so hard to say, but the bottom line is we're living longer, so there can be more of us at one point in time. So it's a really good story about health, really.
Right. So I understand it. They just take their projections. Of course, we don't know it's exactly 100
Yeah.
billion or whatever, plus or minus some
No.
huge number probably. But if you take
Sure.
population growth and the typical death rate versus birth rate for most pre-modern peoples, you end up with
Yeah.
something like that. It's kind of a fun idea because you think, well, there's 8 billion now, 100 billion before us. What's the right number that the Earth could sustain? So,
Yeah.
this is kind of an environment. Back to your beginnings of interest in the environment. What's the carrying capacity for Earth? This is one of those kind of environmental questions. How do you think about that?
I'm glad you asked that because it is the thing that, going back to the roots of me being environmentally minded and you're introduced to this concept of a carrying capacity as if it is a law when you're a student. This is something we can calculate. It's the same thing, a lot of the questions you're asking about how do we get these numbers? It's the same for carrying capacity. People are guessing, they're educated guesses, they have lots of models, but they're guessing. And why are they guessing? Why even engage in this? It's to make a broader point. And so all of our discussions about carrying capacity, I frankly don't care if there's an accurate number. It doesn't really matter because the point is we're supposed to engage in saying, hey, whoever's alive, all of you people, do you realize that what you do matters in terms of production and consumption and the health of the earth? And so, do you think you should go on and doing this forever? I think it's more of a should question and a values question than it is a what is exactly the carrying capacity of the earth. It's not going to get people to change their behavior if we can all agree on the same number. We see that unfortunately over and over again. But it is a useful debate for us to talk about carrying capacity as long as what it does is it shapes the behavior of people who are the biggest consumers, which, by the way, are not the places where population growth is the highest. And so, what I don't like about carrying capacity conversations is that they tend to really quickly zero in on those places where there's 240 something babies born per minute. Well, obviously, that's the problem. It's overpopulation. These people, these women, it becomes are having too many babies. And then it gets to excuse all the highly consumptive behavior of the other end of the scale where there's only 24 or 27 babies born per minute. And so I think those conversations about carrying capacity can be dangerous if that's what it turns into.
Politically dangerous, you mean?
Yeah, and inappropriate because then they lead to just, hey, let's get these women to have fewer babies. And
Yeah,
that's not,
right. Yes, yes.
it seems like action, but it's not going to work.
It's always bothered me about the environmental movement that at first they do a lot of doomsaying, and that seems to
Hmm.
be built into any nonprofit that needs to raise money. If you say things are
Yeah.
good and getting better because of our efforts, that generates less support than if you have the donate here button to stop the world from ending next week. Oh, okay, I better give some money. There is some of that, but also, yeah, this kind of focus
Yeah.
on the negative. We have to stop those people from breeding and using too much stuff, rather than what can we do to get everybody up to a first world level of life quality, healthcare, technology, science. Everybody should have a smartphone. What's wrong with that? Well, they're going to use too many precious minerals. These
Yeah. Yeah.
these
Yeah.
rare earth minerals. So we have to stop that. And Paul Ehrlich famously lost his bet with Julian Simon about over the
Right.
course of a decade, these prices of these metals would go down. Simon predicted, and Ehrlich predicted the opposite, and Ehrlich lost. Again, I think a lot of environmentalists forget, human capital of rationality and problem solving. We're good at this. We're not cattle. We can actually, identify a problem and do something about it. And I wish environmentalists would take more credit for it. It's like, yes, we got active in the 70s and look what we did. This is good. Where I live in
Yeah.
Southern California, the air used to be terrible here in the 70s and 80s.
Oh, yeah.
And I've been an athlete my whole life, and I was a cyclist in the 80s, and you had to be indoors by 11 a.m. or your lungs were fried, and that's not the case anymore. And the environmental movement should get credit for that. And so, yeah, that bothers me about that misdirection. Focus. Why not educate women? Get poor countries to be rich. Then they'll care about the environment, right? Who cares about the environment
Yeah.
if I don't have 3 meals to eat every day?
Yeah. And I think you're right with so much of the environmental movement. I mean, it's a wing and it's not everybody, but it's an influential wing, puts the environment at the center. So we're going to conserve this and protect this. And the danger is the humans. It's like ecologically based, it's eco centered. And if you care about humanity, why not put humanity at the center and say, well, I don't really care if we have a pristine world if the people who are alive are starving in order to make that the case. That's not what was the point of it all. So I mean, but the split is real, and people just value a different thing at the center. But there are plenty of environmentalists. They're not always the loudest ones, or they don't always get the headlines. As you say, it's the doomsayers that get the headlines, but who do put people at the center. I think, you know, just like we were talking about with Ehrlich, there's value in doomsaying because it gets attention. But I actually had a fear writing this book, and I talked to my editor about it, and I said, I am not an alarmist, and I've spent my whole career trying to be really steady and non-alarmist. I don't say this person is too many and this is too few and the world is ending, and you know, if you don't pay attention, then this bad thing happens. And I'm afraid nobody will buy this book because it's not alarmist, because it's balanced and nuanced. She said, well, it might happen,
Mm-hmm.
but it's still, you know, to stick to that. There's so many, almost all the books about population are alarmist. I mean, you know, I've got, my shelves are filled with them, and I just think, well, that might raise awareness, but is it really constructive? I don't think so. I don't want
Well,
to go
is
in
it
that
true?
direction.
This is what we should be focused on, the truth. We
Yeah.
want to know the truth, right? So your book is called 8 billion and counting. So let's keep counting. When will we hit 9 billion, 10 billion? When is it going to peak? What, 11 billion? Where are we going to be 2100? How do you think about those with all the error bars and fuzziness in
Yeah.
the data?
Yeah. Well, and so short answer, and the one everyone should agree on, because it would be true, is that we don't know. And I think the really useful thing about this kind of analysis in this book is that it helps us get a more accurate view of the future, but to understand that what we're doing right now determines that. So the policy decisions that are made today, that's what drives how many people we ultimately end up having. So we do know, you know, as we move further away, the spread gets higher here. You get much less certain over time. It's been about 12 or 13 years between billions. I mean, I talked about I was in college, then a professor, and then now. So when we're going to hit 8 billion, probably in 2023. Um, but between 8 and 9, it will be 1 or 2 years longer than between 6 and 7. And why do we know that? That one we can feel really good about. Global fertility is trending downwards, and it's trending downwards in places where it was really high. Okay, so our confidence can be still looking really good on this. Between 9 and 10, it's fuzzier because we don't know to what degree will those places on the planet that still have really high fertility, how fast will it fall? And this is places, you know, like in Niger, where it's still 7 children per woman on average. We've talked about Nigeria briefly, but looking at over 5 children per woman on average, how fast will their fertility fall? And they're a big country. So how fast their fertility falls actually affects the global numbers. Um, and then places where it is low, does it keep going low? Does it go back up? I don't think we see any indication of it going back up. Um, so we can feel pretty good about that. But it just gets fuzzier and fuzzier over time. So what we should take away from this is, well, what world do you want? You pick, you know, you, whoever you are, you pick. What do you want? What do you want the world to look like? All right, let me explain to you then through this book and the resources it references. If you want that number, here's what you have to do right now in order to get there.
Okay,
That's one of the big takeaways.
I want everybody to live the same quality of life as, say, in Norway, Sweden, the United States, the UK, whatever. Everybody has a smartphone. Everybody has healthcare. Everybody has air conditioning and heating, 3 good square meals a day, a place to live, on and on and on. Okay, so could you do that with, say, 10 billion? Could it top out and we could sustain 10 billion at that level, assuming the usual rate of technological inventions and innovation and progress? Or is that really going to be straining things? Do we need to get down back to where we are now, say 7 to 8 billion by 2100? How do you think about that?
No, I think we could sustain it. I mean, I think it would be irresponsible of us to say we couldn't sustain that because of the policies that would potentially follow from that. I think anytime we're talking about intentionally limiting population, we have to read the subtext, which is, I'm going to need to curtail your rights. Whatever you think it is, your right to a number of children, or your right for the way you live, I'm going to start to curtail that for you. And I think most people are uncomfortable with that. I know I am. And so sure, we have to say we could sustain it. I mean, what we'll also see is there are actually some big differences between among some of those countries you mentioned. I think about childcare a lot. Partly that is because I have a second and third grader who luckily are in school today and everything is going well. But childcare is a big one when you think about whether or not a country has on the low end of low fertility or on the higher end of low fertility. And so when I say low, I'm just meaning below replacement. Each woman on average has below 2.1 children. But we've seen places in the world, in South Korea and in Taiwan, where it's gotten down to 0.9 or 1.1. This is very low. That's a one child difference here, nearly, with looking at places like, some of the Scandinavian countries where it's kind of on the upper end of low fertility. And so there's a lot to take away in terms of gender. And can women have a nice family life and a productive work life at the same time? In a lot of places, the answer is no. And that, when we talked about social norms earlier, that affects our number of children. So if the situation doesn't get better, we're going to hit a peak and we're going to go back down for world population, because you're just going to see the below replacement norm, and we may see it really low.
But like Japan, it could it go to zero? I mean, centuries, 500 years from now, 1,000 years from now, we're just no longer a dominant species. We're just a couple thousand people like we were 100,000 years ago, and this could just be a passing phase in the history of Earth. That couldn't happen, could it?
I guess it could happen. So our questions we need to ask is, what would it take for that not to happen? So what does it take for the nice thing about averages is that if we really peel it back, it means that not everybody's doing the same thing. And so I like to look behind the numbers and say, all right, if you have a country with let's say a 1.5 total fertility rate on average, which Japan might be hanging around there right around now. Is it that everybody in that society has 1.5 children? No, that's biologically impossible. So if we took a street like the street I live on and we went house to house, what proportion of women are completely childless or child-free, as they may call it, because they're happy to make that decision? So there'll be a certain proportion in any society that says, I choose nobody. And then there'll be a certain proportion, like a lot of people in my community, that have 4 or 5 children. And there'll be a certain proportion that have 1 or 2. Those really differ country to country.
And that's when you start trying to understand, where will we be in the future? So if people are totally opting out, then you can ask a set of questions like, wow, why are you totally opting out about this? Is it marriage? You don't want to get married. So it's still really uncommon in Japan to have children outside of marriage. But that's not the case in many other countries. So we can look at that situation and say, 200 years from now, does marriage still seem like a bad option for a young Japanese woman? If it does, then and people don't have children outside of marriage, then we're looking at giving more credence to this idea that the population will disappear. But cultures change and those norms change. So we got to look at the devil's in the details on those things. Is it, and I don't know the numbers for Japan offhand, what proportion is completely child free versus has 2 children or 3 or 1? Because it really differs in a lot of places. I do remember in some research for the book that Russia does not have a lot of people with 0 children. So that's interesting. So we got to look at, could they totally disappear? Maybe so, but if we want to understand whether they would or not, we have to understand the reasons, all the rainbow of reasons of why people are not having 2 children on average.
Yeah, this brings up two different pathways we can go down. One is Social Security, retirement. Is the concern that as an aging population gets older and there's just fewer younger people coming into the labor market to support us? Since I've been paying, I'm a baby boomer. I was born in '54, so I'm closing in on the finish line here, and I want my retirement. And so I don't think it's going to be a problem in the United States. I think they'll keep it funded. But I could see the argument that in some countries, if you just don't have enough youthful people to support the aging population, we're going to have a problem.
Yeah, and I think the how does the problem manifest is the question that I like to tackle as a political scientist. Because if you're looking at a country where, let's take China, for example, this is one of the things that I see, I even see in the national security community. Um, China's aging population will bankrupt the country, they say. Well, what makes you say that? Are you extrapolating from the United States and putting it on China? And most of the time, the answer is yes. And so you have to say, well, what are the rules of the game in China? What proportion of the population is currently covered by a pension? What's the savings rate like? What are the expectations that people have that the government is the last stop versus the family is the last stop? What kind of pressure could the Chinese people put on the government to change the rules? We've seen them change some of their rules. It's incremental, it's small. Um, and so if you look at a country like France, and they're trying to raise the retirement age, and people take to the streets and they effectively put pressure on the politicians, and they're unable to raise the retirement age, versus a country where perhaps the people have less of a say over what happens in the government, like perhaps China. You might actually see countries that are non-democratic economically fare better than democracies under conditions of population aging, because they have the ability to, wave their wand and change the rules. So I think that's yeah, the concern is, are there enough workers per retirees? That's just the starting point of the conversation, though. There's a lot more that can be said on top of that.
Right. Right. So if you're a policymaker or a politician in a country, that has to be in the equation. What are we going to do in 20 years when all these people move out of the labor force into retirement and not as many people are coming from youth into the labor force? Yeah, there has to be some calculations there. All right. Then the other subject, the another hot button topic is abortion, unwanted pregnancies, and so on. So you talk about the womb wars in your book. I'm pro-choice, but I'm trying to wrap my mind around the pro-life arguments. What are their good arguments? And I presume you're pro-choice, are you?
I don't talk about abortion at all in my book. I
Yeah.
talk about some of the outcomes of it, and I'm really careful about that because I do engage with all kinds of organizations about population
Mm,
and why it
right.
matters. Yeah.
Planned Parenthood being one of them, but they've been a target of conservatives of late for various reasons, and so I've been trying to understand why that is, because it seems like a good idea, giving women choices, and you can plan it out. That seems right. Education, access to birth control, and so on. The conservative argument is this. First, the problem isn't abortions; it's unwanted pregnancies. Okay, why are women getting pregnant when they don't want to? Okay, so my answer is, well, because they don't have access to birth control and they weren't educated properly in school about this, and economic empowerment. So on, the conservative counter to that is no, they lack religion, they lack discipline, they lack some kind of commitment to abstain from sex and wait till marriage. Kind of the typical Christian fundamentalist conservative in America type argument that we're familiar with. I don't know. I don't know where we want to go with this, and my dog's getting all crazy now, barking there over this hot button subject.
Hot issues.
But so I mean, it comes down to, your book deals with sex. Why do people have sex? Well, it's part of our human drive. So it seems to me this idea, and there's been a few studies on abstinence only programs. And their argument is, well, if you hand out, their other argument is the country's already awash in birth control. It's everywhere. You can get it pretty much for free. Everyone has access to it. They know they should use it, and they're not. And they're still getting pregnant, and that's why we're still having abortions. These people, not just women, but because they're having sex with somebody, men, they're all undisciplined. They need religion. I don't know. Give us your thoughts on that, if you care to.
One of the things I think is really striking about some of our year-on-year reports we get about U.S. fertility trends is that, and I think most of your listeners and you would know, it's down, right? So it's going year on end. The birth rates are down in the US, or the total fertility rate is down in the US. People are having fewer children. And then you say, why are they having fewer children? Or who is having fewer children? It's teens and adolescents. So what else is down? Abortions are down. So both abortions are down and births are down to people of those age groups. And that actually has huge effects on the national level as well, of course, because we're aggregating these data. So I think that's really interesting to see that people are, if I've seen some reports, but I would not feel like I'm the expert in this at all. But I'll say things for us to look into. Are people having less sex in high school? Some reports that say in general they are. And then of those that do, are they clearly being more careful? If both births are down and abortions are down, that would show that that's really changing. I think that's really interesting, and it's interesting how that's driving some of the numbers that we're seeing. So even our local news here in Memphis last night was talking about the U.S. birth rate being low, and I thought, wow, that's kind of unusual that they would mention this. And so it's big news in the U.S. And when we peel it back and see that that's really one of the driving factors, that's really interesting, because that actually shows that that's a good thing. Because most of the time when you hear U.S. birth rate low, it is alarmist. Like we said, this is the doomsday. Oh no, now U.S. is going the way of Japan. And we peel back that layer of the onion and we say, yeah, you know how you guys didn't want teen pregnancies and teen abortions? We don't want anybody to deal with that.
Mm-hmm.
It's getting better.
Mm-hmm.
So that's good. That's interesting.
Yeah, I agree. That's the trend I've seen too. A few studies on so-called iGen generation. These are kids born after 9/11, I guess. Yeah, they're drinking less, they're partying less, they're doing less drugs, they're having less sex, and they're not getting driver's licenses. They're just kind of moving in a different direction. And there's some concern, oh, they're coddled or whatever. Okay, that's one thing, but actually, there's some positive trends. Those are good things. They don't drink as much.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And as I kind of said earlier, trends change fast, but our thinking doesn't. I think that's another example where I bet if any of us went out on the street and we just said, "Tell me what you know about teen births or teen abortion in the U.S.," they'd be like, "Oh my gosh, it's too high. It's terrible," because we don't realize that trend changed fast.
Let me bring this to the finish line here. Read your last paragraph from the book because I really liked it. Our world of 8 billion will become a world of 9 billion, then 10 billion. While the pace at which global population is growing is slowing, we are still a world of 8 billion and counting. Any snapshot in time, these billions will comprise babies, children, workers, retirees, and those in the twilight of life. Just as an individual progresses through different ages and stages, societies go through the various demographic transitions, travel through ages and stages as well. The political opinions, consumer behaviors, and social abilities of generations of today have been and will continue to be shaped by their experiences with global recessions, pandemics, and wars, or stock market booms, flourishing peace, and technological revolutions. We are an independent, interconnected world, and the challenges that besiege one country easily touch us all. Disease, climate change, and economic crisis. But so do the good fortunes, as our interconnected economic world shows. The question we have before us is, how could we use the 8 billion people we have on the planet today to shape the world we want tomorrow? All right, so give us a final statement. How do you answer that last question?
I think I'm with you on wanting to see the playing field leveled. So one of the things that I think really characterizes this moment in time for us is this huge divide between the richer countries in the world and richer people and the poorer countries in the world. And so when I think about moving forward from this moment, it's about saying who's forgotten in this world, who is being left behind, who's carrying the greater burden, and trying to alleviate some of that. So this would be giving a better quality of life to people where right now fertility is really high. Well, if we give them more education and we allow them more choice in life with job opportunities and work outside the home, then their lives will be better and the divide will start to lessen.